Welcome to the deep dive. Let's jump straight in with something, well, a bit startling, actually.
Oh,
Yeah, in 2023, global hydropower generation. It hit a low point we haven't seen in decades.
wow.
Yeah, just think about that. Dams not full, and that directly impacting power supplies in, major countries.
That's absolutely right. And to really get into why that happened and what it means for all of us, we've been digging into the International Energy Agency's big report, Electricity 2024.
The IEA, right.
Yeah, and this isn't just a skim read. It's a really deep analysis. It covers recent policies, what's happening in the markets, and forecasts right up to 2026. Demand, supply, even CO2 emissions, it's all in there.
And the IEA, just so everyone's clear, they're a major voice in energy. They advise loads of countries members like Australia, Canada, Germany, Japan, the US.
UK, France,
Right. And also association countries, big players like Brazil, China, India.
South Africa too. They advise them on keeping energy reliable, affordable, and crucially, sustainable. So yeah, their reports carry weight.
Definitely. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to pull out the absolute must-know stuff from this huge report.
Exactly. We want to highlight the key trends, the challenges the whole electricity sector is facing right now.
And crucially, what does it all mean for you listening right now?
That's the connection we want to make.
Okay, so what are the big headlines jumping out from this report? I saw mentions of European electricity demand falling,
Yes, that's a big one.
the weather causing all sorts of problems for power grids,
Definitely seeing more of that,
data centers just gobbling up electricity.
but ever-growing issue.
And then, of course, what's happening with nuclear and renewables. Lots to cover. Where do we start?
Let's kick off with that European demand drop. It's quite something.
Okay.
So for 2 years running 2022 and 2023, electricity demand in the EU actually went down, about 3.1% the first year, then 3.2%.
So lower demand, that's surprising with things like EVs picking up.
It is, isn't it? It brings consumption down to levels we haven't seen for, well, about 2 decades.
20 years. Wow. So what's behind that? Is it people just being more efficient?
That might play a small part, but the report points mainly to weaker industrial consumption. Industry just using less power.
Ah, okay. Because energy prices were so high.
Exactly. Even though prices came down from those crazy peaks in 2022, they were still, significantly higher than before the pandemic.
Right.
And here's a really key phrase from the report. They talk about possible permanent demand destruction.
Permanent. That sounds serious.
It does. It suggests that in really energy-hungry sectors like chemicals or primary metals, some businesses might be permanently scaling back or even moving production out of the EU because costs are just too high.
So making stuff elsewhere because the power's cheaper there?
Essentially, yes. And the
Yes.
numbers back that up.
Yeah.
In 2022, these indirect electricity imports, basically, importing goods that need a lot of energy to make shot up.
Right, like importing the finished metal instead of making it here.
Precisely. It accounted for about 6% of the EU's demand, effectively.
Hmm.
Primary aluminum was a big one, with more coming in from places like India and the UAE.
So we're kind of outsourcing our energy use in a way.
That's a good way to think about it. The report expected this to dip slightly in 2023, but still stay above 2021 levels.
Interesting. And did the report mention anything about, say, Russia's role in this, given the sanctions?
It did. Russia's share in those indirect imports dropped quite a bit, from about 18% pre-war down to maybe 9%.
Okay.
But it also notes that some things, like primary aluminum from Russia that isn't sanctioned, are still very much part of EU supply chains, even with calls to change that.
Okay, that's a complex picture on the demand side. What about the actual price of electricity? We all felt that roller coaster.
Globally, yes, wholesale prices did fall in 2023 from the record highs of 2022. That was mostly tied to lower natural gas and coal prices.
Some relief then.
Some, but it varied a lot. In Europe, prices dropped by over 50% on average, which sounds great. But they were still double the 2019 levels, so still expensive compared to before.
And elsewhere, like the US.
Much less dramatic. U.S. prices in 2023 were maybe only 15% higher than in 2019. Japan and India also stayed quite a bit above their 2019 prices.
So Europe really got hit hardest and is still feeling it
Generally, yes. Although the Nordic countries are an interesting exception.
because of their hydropower.
Exactly. Their prices were much more comparable to the U.S. or Australia. It shows the benefit of having that stable domestic hydro resource.
Makes sense.
But looking ahead, the report mentions uncertainty, particularly around France getting its nuclear plants fully back online and, volatile gas prices.
Yeah.
That's keeping future prices for European winters looking quite high.
Right. Okay. Let's pivot to the weather then. You mentioned hydro earlier, and the report flags big weather impacts in 2023.
Huge impacts. That global hydropower slump we started with, that was down to widespread droughts. Canada, China, India, the US, Mexico, Turkey, Vietnam, loads of places affected.
So less rain, less water in dams,
Yeah,
less power.
pretty much. The global capacity factor for hydro, basically how much power it actually produced versus its maximum potential, dropped below 40%.
Yeah.
Lowest in at least 30 years, the IEA says.
And the knock-on effects.
Well, in some countries, it meant straight-up energy shortages. They had to burn more fossil fuels, coal, gas, just to keep the lights on.
Not great for emissions targets.
Not at all. And it raised big questions about supply stability. Plus, you had extreme weather events causing direct damage. Ice storms in the U.S., cyclones in India, leading to massive power outages.
So it's resilience that's becoming key here, making sure the grid can handle these shocks.
Resilience is absolutely vital. And it wasn't just the headline-grabbing storms. The report also points to issues like just not having enough power plants, problems getting fuel, or grid failures causing major outages.
Where were those issues most common?
Mostly in emerging economies: Pakistan, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, Brazil, parts of Central Asia, South Africa. A long list, unfortunately.
It highlights that need for investment.
Definitely. And it creates this tricky feedback loop, doesn't it? Climate change means more extreme weather impacting supply, but it also means we need more power for things like cooling.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So how are grid operators trying to manage this, especially with more variable renewables like wind and solar?
It's getting more complex. Traditionally, big power plants, the ones with spinning turbines, provide something called inertia.
Inertia, like momentum.
Kind of, yeah. It helps keep the grid's frequency stable, resists sudden changes. As we rely less on those, we need other ways to maintain stability.
Okay, so what are they doing?
Some places are setting minimum inertia levels the system has to maintain. We're also seeing new markets pop up for things like fast frequency response.
Like quick-acting shock absorbers for the grid.
That's a great analogy. The UK, Ireland, Australia are implementing these. They react in fractions of a second to stabilize things after a disturbance.
And I guess batteries must play a big role here.
Absolutely crucial. Batteries can provide that fast response, they add flexibility, and they're essential for soaking up excess renewable energy and releasing it when needed. Really key for integrating more wind and solar smoothly.
Makes sense. Okay, let's talk about data centers. Feels like every time you blink, their energy use has gone up again.
It's a relentless rise.
Yeah.
The report really flags this as a major driver of global electricity demand growth.
Any specific numbers?
Well, in China, demand from data centers is expected to double by 2030. The IEA thinks by 2026, just Chinese data centers could be using around 300 terawatt hours.
That's a lot of electricity.
It is. And it's driven by everything from AI and crypto to just more cloud computing, 5G, the Internet of Things. It all needs data centers.
So how do we stop this getting completely out of control? Are there efforts to make them more efficient?
Yes, definitely. Regulators are stepping in. Ireland, for example, has new rules for grid connections. They're looking at where data centers are built, whether they have on-site generation or storage, if they can be flexible with their demand.
So making them part of the solution, not just the problem.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And there's a big push for efficiency. The EU's updated energy efficiency directive has mandatory reporting for data centers now and rules about recovering waste heat.
Waste heat, like using the heat they generate for something else.
Exactly. Potentially for district heating systems nearby. It's being explored seriously. The U.S. is funding research into efficient chips. China has renewable energy targets specifically for public data centers.
And technology itself,
Yeah.
better cooling.
Yeah, things like direct-to-chip water cooling, using AI or machine learning to optimize how the center runs. Lots of innovation happening because the need is so clear.
Okay, good to hear. There's focus on that.
Yeah.
Another trend mentioned is more people generating their own power, like with rooftop solar, self-consumption.
That's definitely growing. Distributed generation, mostly solar panels on homes and businesses, is taking off, and people are using more of the power they generate themselves.
Where's this happening most?
Italy's a good example. Maybe 2% of their total demand in 2022 was self-consumed. Germany, Spain, Brazil, Japan were seeing similar trends, around 1%. And it's really picking up speed in Spain and Brazil.
How does that change things for the main grid operators?
It makes their job harder in some ways. They need much better data on how much power is being generated out there on rooftops and when it's being used.
Because it affects how much power they need to supply.
Exactly. It impacts their forecasts, how they plan the grid, how much flexibility they need to balance everything second by second.
So better communication is needed.
Definitely. Better data sharing between the local distribution companies and the main transmission grid operators is becoming vital.
But isn't there a privacy issue there, tracking individual energy use?
That's a very real concern.
Yeah.
New EU rules actually came in last year aiming to improve data access while making sure consumer privacy is protected. It's a balancing act.
And presumably things like smart meters help with getting that data.
They're key. Smart meter investment doubled globally between 2015 and 2022. Over $1 billion are installed now.
$1 billion. Who's leading on that?
China's way out in front, then the EU and the US. But penetration varies hugely around the world. Some places are nearly fully covered, others are just starting.
Okay, let's zoom out again. The overall picture of electricity generation. Are renewables really taking over?
Growth was a bit slower in 2023, around 5%. That compares to 8% the year before.
Why the slowdown?
Mainly that weak hydropower output we talked about. It dragged the average down.
But is it expected to pick up?
Oh, yes. The forecast for 2024 is a big jump, maybe 14% growth, assuming hydro gets back to normal. Then it's expected to average around 9% a year for 2025, 2026. So strong growth continues.
And what about nuclear? You mentioned France's recovery.
Nuclear is also set for growth. Global generation is forecast to hit a new record high in 2025.
Really? Where is that growth coming from?
Partly the French recovery, yes.
Mm.
Also Japan restarting some plants. And significantly, new plants coming online. About half of those are in China and India.
Yeah.
Average growth expected around 3% a year through 2026.
Okay, so renewables and nuclear up. What about fossil fuels? Coal and gas?
The whole share is definitely shrinking. It was 36% of global generation in 2023, but the IEA expects it to drop below one-third by 2026.
So have we passed peak coal?
It looks very likely that 2023 was the peak for coal-fired generation. Yeah. A decline is expected from this year onward.
And natural gas.
Gas is expected to keep rising, but slowly. Less than 1% a year growth forecast to 2026. Some of that is actually countries switching from coal to gas, which is cleaner, but still a fossil fuel.
So adding it all up.
The overall share of fossil fuels in global electricity generation is projected to fall from 61% in 2023 down to 54% by 2026.
54%. That would be the first time it's below 60%. Yeah.
Exactly. And the fastest rate of decline the IEA has ever recorded. It's a significant shift underway.
Absolutely. Now, you touched on nuclear growth. The report mentions quite a bit of activity there, even beyond China and India.
That's right. There seems to be a renewed interest, maybe driven by energy security concerns and climate targets. At the COP28 climate conference, over 20 countries actually signed a pledge to triple nuclear capacity by 2050.
Triple it. That's ambitious. Are countries putting concrete plans in place?
Some are. France is talking about potentially 14 new large reactors. The Netherlands, Sweden, they've announced plans for new builds too.
What about countries that were phasing out nuclear?
Well, Belgium's actually extending the life of 2 reactors it was planning to close. Poland is moving ahead with its first plant. Ukraine wants to expand. Canada's building new capacity. Even Brazil and Argentina have projects, though some face delays.
But isn't building these things incredibly difficult and expensive? The track record isn't great.
That's the huge challenge. Construction risk is a massive hurdle for financing. The report notes projects started between 2010 and 2020 averaged about a 3-year delay. And delays were even longer in Europe and the U.S. compared to China.
So how do you overcome that?
Standardization of designs is one potential way to reduce risk and cost. More government involvement is in other things like guaranteeing prices or using specific financing models like the UK's regulated asset-based model.
Does labeling nuclear as green help?
It's debated. The EU included it under specific conditions in its taxonomy, kind of as a transition fuel. But many private investors are still cautious.
And this is where small modular reactors, SMRs, come in.
Exactly. The hope is that building smaller, factory-produced modules could cut down construction time and risk, making them easier to finance.
Are they close to reality?
There's a lot of development, over 85 designs being worked on in loads of countries. France is investing heavily. There's even research into tiny microreactors for remote places, but they still face regulatory and cost hurdles.
Okay. Let's talk gas turbines. If we're moving to renewables, will we still need them?
It's a bit counterintuitive, but yes, probably for a while. Even as renewables grow, we still need power plants that can be switched on quickly when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing or during peak demand.
So gas plants for backup and flexibility.
Right. The IEA actually sees Global installed gas turbine capacity increasing by 10% by 2030.
Really? Even with
Oh.
climate goals?
Well, the long-term plan, or hope, is that these turbines will eventually run on cleaner fuels like hydrogen. All the major manufacturers are working on hydrogen-ready turbines.
Interesting. And who makes these turbines? Is it a secure supply chain?
It's quite concentrated. Just a few big names dominate: GE, Siemens Energy, Mitsubishi Power. And manufacturing is mostly in North America and Europe.
What about the materials they need?
That's a potential bottleneck. They rely on critical minerals, things like cobalt, nickel, rhenium, and the mining for those is often concentrated in just a few countries.
Like,
South Africa, Australia, the Congo, for example. And the processing, especially for cobalt, is heavily dominated by China.
so potential supply chain risks there.
Yes, which is why increasing recycling of the materials in old turbines is becoming more important to reduce reliance on new mining.
Makes sense. Now, let's bring it back to people's pockets. The report talks about the impact of those high electricity prices, especially on industry.
Yeah, European industry really felt the pain in 2022. Compared to competitors in the US or Asia, their electricity costs were often much, much higher, particularly in countries reliant on gas or coal, like Germany or Italy.
And that ties back to the indirect imports idea.
Exactly. If it's too expensive to make things in Europe, companies import them, which has knock-on effects for jobs and the economy.
Did governments step in to help?
Yes, lots of measures were put in place. Germany had temporary price caps for industry. France adjusted its system for selling nuclear power at regulated prices.
And for households?
A whole range of things: tax cuts, price freezes, direct payments. Think of Chile freezing tariffs, the UK's price cap, Norway's rebate scheme. The EU also brought in emergency measures.
Do they work?
The impact varied a lot. Poland's price freeze offered significant protection, while measures in places like Finland were maybe less comprehensive. The EU's now reformed its market design, trying to find longer-term solutions for stability and affordability.
Right. One last big theme. Reliability and security. It feels like keeping the lights on is getting more attention.
It absolutely is. As we electrify more transport, heating, and rely more on weather-dependent renewables, grid security becomes paramount.
So the IEA is focusing on this more.
Yes, the report has a whole new chapter dedicated to monitoring electricity security. It's tracking things like those measures for system inertia and fast frequency response we discussed.
And just basic grid upgrades.
Crucial. Grid modernization and expansion are mentioned constantly throughout the report in different regions. India is building green energy corridors. Korea is expanding its grid for high-tech industries. You can't integrate renewables or handle new demand without a robust grid.
What about tracking outages? Do we know enough about why they happen?
The report argues we need better data, especially on the local distribution level. It praises Turkey as an example of detailed data collection. Understanding of the causes, technical failures, weather, even human error during maintenance or connections is vital for improving reliability.
Human error is a factor.
Apparently quite a significant one, yes. Things going wrong during grid connections or routine work, it all needs to be tracked and learned from.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Before we wrap up, were there any standout points from specific regions? Maybe Asia?
Sure. In Asia, India is really pushing hydropower, nuclear storage, and grid upgrades. Japan's reforming its capacity and balancing markets. Korea's focused on grid expansion for its industries and promoting distributed energy. Southeast Asia sees rising demand, met by a mix of coal, gas, and growing renewables, though Vietnam hit power shortages last year.
And the Americas?
U.S. demand dipped due to weather, but is expected to grow with electrification and data centers. Winter reliability is a concern, though. Canada's hydropower took that hit we mentioned. Mexico's hydro was also very low due to drought, while nearshoring could boost its industrial demand. Colombia was affected by El Niño impacting its hydro.
Europe, we touched on the EU reforms.
Yeah, besides the market reforms, Germany's grappling with grid congestion. France is focused on its nuclear recovery and renewables. The UK, Italy and Spain saw strong renewable growth.
Middle East, often about oil, but electricity.
Growing demand there too, especially for cooling and desalination in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Saudi has nuclear plans and big grid interconnection projects. The UAE is working on energy efficiency, like optimizing air conditioning.
And Africa.
South Africa's load-shedding crisis continues, despite efforts to bring in private generation and new auctions. Morocco's pushing renewables. Nigeria passed a new electricity act aiming for more privatization. Kenya has a high share of renewables already. Senegal's making progress on access with international support. It's a very diverse picture across the continent.
It really is a global story with so many interconnected parts. Okay, let's try and summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive.
I think the big themes are definitely that complex dance between shifting demand, especially in industry, and the supply side. Then there's the huge impact of weather volatility, which seems to be increasing.
Right, and the relentless growth of data centers' energy appetite. That's a major factor now.
Absolutely. Plus, the changing generation mixed renewables growing strongly but facing integration challenges, nuclear seeing renewed interest but with old hurdles, and fossil fuels beginning that historic decline.
And underpinning it all is the absolute need for grid reliability, security, and the right policy frameworks to manage this transition.
Couldn't agree more. It's a massive transformation underway.
Okay, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. We've talked about interconnectedness, global supply chains for turbines, international grid projects.
Yeah, the system's becoming more linked globally.
So, as we push through this energy transition, how might that very interconnectedness amplify things? Could it create bigger opportunities, but also bigger risks? What sort of unexpected dependencies might pop up that we haven't even thought about yet?
That's a really interesting question, something definitely worth pondering as we build this new energy future.
If you want to dive even deeper into the numbers and forecasts, do check out the full Electricity 2024 report from the IEA. It's worth thinking about how these huge global shifts might eventually touch your own energy use.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.